Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about the 8 books that I read in the month of April. So let's get into the video. I know that the last video that I put out was my March wrap up, so it's back to back, but I didn't want to fall behind on this video and leave it till May. So I decided to take a plunge and film it today. So if you're not familiar, we're going to briefly go over stats and then I'll get into the 8 books that I read in the month of April. Earlier this month, I was in Arizona for an entire week, which was fantastic. I have a little bit of a tan now. I don't know if you can tell, but I do. And so that really disrupted both my reading schedule and filming. So here we are. But yes, Arizona was amazing. I didn't film as much as I would have liked to. I do have a couple of clips here and there. I thought about making a vlog, but I don't have enough footage for a full vlog. So maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that particular trip during a different video and insert the clips. That way you can go ahead and see them. But with that, let's get into the stats for the month of April. And as always, we're going to start with my stats from Storygraph. So in the month of April, I read a total of 8 books. That comes to about 1,834 pages. And my top 4 moods were dark, mysterious, reflective, and emotional. Is that a surprise for anybody? No. But what is a surprise is that my 5th mood is adventurous, which is probably due to the fantasy books that I read. So in terms of pace, 14% or 1 book that I read was considered fast-paced, while 86% or the other 7 books that I read were considered medium-paced. Now, I read 1 book that was over 500 pages, 1 book that was between 300 and 500 pages, and the other 6 books that I read were all under 300 pages. So I read a lot of very short books this month, which is not typical of me. Usually I read books that are between 300 and 500 pages long. I gravitated toward shorter books this month, so yeah, that's a surprise. I did finish 1 nonfiction book, which was Bottle of Lies, and this talks about the generic drug boom in America, and the other 7 books that I read were all fiction books. So according to Storygraph, my most read genre this past month was literary fiction, which does track, followed by mystery, horror, and then magical realism. And then I did read 1 fantasy book this month. So my average rating in the month of April was the lowest that it's been all year, which is super interesting to me because it's the month that I decided to mood read. And here we are. So my average rating is 3.44 with 2 books that I rated 4 stars, 4 books that I rated 3.5 stars, 1 book that I rated 3 stars, and 1 book that I rated 2.5 stars. So in general, I read books that I enjoyed. Anything that I rate a 3 and higher are books that I at least enjoy, right? Or I found something really intriguing about them. So really, I only read 1 book that I didn't quite enjoy. So still a pretty good month for me. It was just lower than I expected it to be. It is my first reading month for quarter 2, and it's not off to a great start. So we'll see how we can improve that later on. So moving on to the handy dandy journal, I had 0.5 stars this month. Not this month, last month in April, which is fine, right? Not all books can be my new favorite books of all time. So out of the 8 books that I read, 1 of them came off of my physical TBR. It's right here. I'll talk about it in a little bit. 5 of them were books I borrowed from the library, and 2 of them were advanced reader copies that I received through NetGalley. In terms of format, 4 of them were audiobooks. I read 3 ebooks, and 1 of them is a physical book that I read. Yet again, another month where I reread 0 books. However, there are improvements in other categories from March. So I did read 2 translated works, whoop whoop. 4 of the books that I read were written by non-men, which means the other 4 were written by men. I did read 3 books by Latinx authors, 2 books by Black authors, and all of the 8 books that I read in April were by new to me authors. So this is the first time that I've read from each of these authors, which I feel also explains why my average rating is a little bit lower. All of these authors were across a variety of different genres with different writing styles and paces and tones, and covered a variety of different topics. So I feel like my mood zigzagged through the month, and there was quite some time during the month where I couldn't pin down exactly what I wanted to read. And so I was rotating through like 6 books at a time, trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to read, and I just couldn't find it at the moment. The oldest book that I read was published in 2015, and that is a novella called Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. My favorite book was Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, which is a translated novel. I didn't finish any series in the month of April, as you can tell. I did continue one, which is A Song of Ice and Fire. I've been reading through A Storm of Swords. I just didn't finish it in April, which is why it's not listed here. And then I actually did start another series in the month of April. I know, who am I? I'm starting a new series. I started one in March, now one in April. And this is The Lies of the Ajungo by Moses Ose Utomi. Okay, so with that, let's get into the book reviews, starting off with the books that I didn't finish in the month of April. The book that I DNF'd in the month of April is called What Lies in the Woods by Kate Alice Marshall. This is a recent release that is a thriller, and I don't really have a good reason to DNF this book other than I had the audiobook and I was listening to it, and eventually other books caught my attention more than this one. I forgot about it. When I came back to finish it, my loan had ended through the library, and I didn't like it enough to request it all over again, wait another 8 weeks, and then start it all over again, if that makes sense. So in this one, we're following 3 girls who, when they were little, they went out into the woods, and one of them was severely stabbed, like 8 times or something like that. And all of them testified, put this man in jail. Now we're in the present with them. They're adults and they've gone their separate ways. They're dealing with their own trauma when they get a call that this man has passed away in jail, and they decide to come together again and meet in their hometown. And from there, we start to learn secrets and lies that these girls have told. So I personally didn't get too far into this book. I think I made it maybe 4 or 5 chapters in, and while I was reading it, it was flowing smoothly. The chapters were short, it was digestible, it was a fine writing style. I just wasn't gripped. I want a thriller to grip me and to make me wonder and have me at the edge of my seat, and unfortunately, this one didn't. And okay, it could have been that I wasn't in a thriller mood either, because I did pick up another thriller that did keep me engaged, but I felt like I was in the wrong mood to read it. I was leaning more towards literary fiction, which, as you can tell by my stats, is where I ended up going towards. So that was What Lies in the Woods. Why don't we start off talking about the one and only nonfiction book that I read in the month of April. That is Bottle of Lies, The Inside Story of the Generic Drug Boom, and this is by Katherine Eban. So I think I mentioned during my March wrap-up that I work in the healthcare industry, and because of that, I try to read books related to healthcare, and apart from that, I ended up reading Empire of Pain last year, which is a fantastic book. By the way, highly recommend. And that really talked about the Sackler family and the empire that they built, but it really does focus on an established pharmaceutical company in the United States that creates brand name medications. And I wanted to see the other side of that because generics flooded the market in the late 1900s, right? And it's something that is talked about a lot today in the healthcare industry, making medicines more affordable and more accessible. And so I wanted to pick up a book that really addressed that topic. Hence, this is where Bottle of Lies comes in. And when I tell you that it was a sobering read, I really mean it. And I guess what I realized from reading this book is how little I continue to know about the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. So in this one, we are focusing primarily on a company called Ranbaxy, which is a pharmaceutical company that produces generics to mail and sell all over the world, including the United States. And it is a company that is based in India. And what I really enjoyed about this book is how the author really illustrated the industry and the forces at play that led to the events of this book. And I'm trying to be as vague as possible because parts of this book really read like a crime thriller or like a conspiracy thriller where you just really want to know what the heck is going to happen next, especially when it has such large implications on human health and equity, right? One thing I will say that I learned from this book is that not all generics are made equal. I always assumed that generics were the same caliber as their brand name counterparts, and that's not really the case. They just have to prove bioequivalency to the brand name rather than conduct their own trials to prove that their medication is effective on a patient, which I thought, like, what? And the FDA allows this to happen. Anyways, highly recommend if that sounds the least bit interesting to you. Really important, really sobering and informative. And if I ever end up taking a medication and I end up on a generic, I will definitely be doing my research into which company is producing it. I'll just say that. But yes, I gave this book 4 stars. Since I mentioned that Bottle of Lies reads a little bit like a crime thriller, let's talk about the only fiction thriller that I read and finished, and that is City Under One Roof by Iris Yamashita. Now, this is this author's debut novel. I believe she is a screenwriter though, so she has a lot of experience writing plots and characters, which you can really tell in this book because this community that she creates in her book feels so real. So this book is set in Point Meteor, Alaska, and I actually don't know if this is a real place in Alaska, but that's what it is in the book. And it's a very small, isolated town with just under 200 people that live in this town and on this island, and they all seem to live in this giant apartment complex. There is also only one way in and one way out of this town, and it is through this bridge that sometimes seems to be closed for one reason or another. And so at the beginning of the book, one of our main characters finds a severed foot and a hand just, casually out there in the Alaskan wilderness, and they don't really know who it belongs to. The tourist season has ended and no one seems to be missing. And so the police that come from out of town to investigate just rule it as an accident and close the case. However, there is a detective out there who is not convinced that there was no wrongdoing. She really wants to solve this crime. Her name is Kara, and she's also coming from out of town. She partners up with the local PD of that town and starts to try to gain the trust of this very tight community. There's one way in and out. Someone from this community needs to have done it. The setting was just so vivid and vibrant. The characters had so many complex backstories. It just felt like a real town with real people. I also really like thrillers with a detective component. I know some people don't like that. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I will add one more thing because I know this bothers some people, but this was set up as a closed circle mystery from the beginning, and halfway through the novel, the author introduces some new characters that may or may not impact whether this is a closed circle mystery or not. That's all I'll say because I don't want to spoil anything, but if that bothers you that this is technically not a closed circle mystery, then I feel like you might be disappointed. The next 3 books that I ended up finishing in the month of April are all novellas, so I'll talk about them in the order that I read them. The first one of those is Grief is the Thing with Feathers. This is by Max Porter, and I did give it 3.5 stars. This was just so beautifully written in a really haunting way. I read this book as an audiobook, and that's how I recommend you read it because the narrator does such a fantastic job at imbuing and filling the words with emotion. Some parts of this novella just left me in awe at the beautiful sentences and imagery and sentences, and other parts of it had me so anxious and so full of dread because of the nature of the book. So let me backtrack and tell you what this book is about. So in it, we're following 3 characters, a dad and his 2 sons, and their mother has recently passed away. So naturally, all 3 of them are handling grief in a very different way. Now there is a crow that is also a character in this book who comes into their life and refuses to leave until they've overcome this grief. And the crow manifests in their life in a variety of different ways, as a friend, as an antagonist, as something to be feared, depending on where they are in their journey. It was honestly such a beautiful and scary story at the same time. Oh, that's so funny. I just noticed that I gave 3.5 stars to all of the novellas that I read in April. Huh. They're completely different though. The next novella that I read is a literary fiction novel, and that is called The Private Life of Trees by Alejandro Zambra, and this is one of the translated works that I read. This is translated by Megan McDowell. So this is a difficult book for me to describe and to recommend. At the end of it, I walked away not quite knowing what I just read and what it's about, but still feeling something. And I didn't know what that something was. I just knew that I enjoyed the book and it made me question and think. Let me try my best to put my thoughts into words. So this is one of those books where it illustrates how different people come in and out of your life and the impact that they make and the remnants that they leave behind. Really, that's how I would describe this novella. But to give you a sense of what the plot is like, we're following primarily two people. The first person's name is Julian, and we get to hear through his side of the story how he was with this ex-girlfriend and how he met this other girl through a cake that he was going to give to his ex-girlfriend, and how this other lady has a daughter. And that's our second main character, Daniela. And I know that premise sounds horrifying because it almost seems like Julian and Daniela are going to have some sort of romantic relationship, which they don't. But it's really just about Julian and Daniela, her growing up with a stepfather, him coming into the life of this woman, her daughter, and becoming a father all of a sudden. And this is all told within the span of 100 pages, or about 100 pages, but we cover so many decades of these people's lives, and we really get this vivid picture of who they are and the people that have come in and out of their lives. Again, really interesting concept. When I immediately finished it, I didn't quite get the point of the story, but it's a book that really had me feeling some kind of way, a positive way. The last and final novella that I read in the month of April was the fantasy series that I started. This is going to be the first novella in the Forever Desert series, and it is called The Lies of the Ajungo by Moses Utomi, and it is a desert fantasy. When I first started The Lies of the Ajungo, it reminded me a lot of, what's that book by Chinua Achebe? The Things They Care, no, Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart, because it feels like a story that was like orally passed down. So the entire time while I was reading it, it felt like someone was telling me a story about something that happened to them, which personally I always find as a refreshing mode of storytelling. So the storytelling is very simple, it's very straight to the point. I feel like a lot of people will say that the author was telling and not showing, but that was just the style of the narrative, and it really quite worked for me. Just like the storytelling method, the actual story is also very basic and simple, but it works. It worked for me. I gave it 3.5 stars, and I don't want to say too much because it is a novella, but essentially we are in the City of Lies. And the City of Lies has no water, and they also don't have any men with tongues. And the reason for that is because the City of Lies made a pact with the Ajungo people. In exchange for their abundant water, they need to cut off the tongues of any boy who comes of age in exchange for that water. So that's one thing I will say. If you don't like on-page violence, this does have some of that, so please look up trigger warnings before going in. And so our main character, Tutu, is approaching his 14th birthday where his tongue will be cut off. But his mom is also struggling. She is severely dehydrated, and one day she passes out in the middle of the street. Now the city is under such severe strain and lack of water that people are not willing to sacrifice their own water to save this woman. And so he decides that he's going to take up the mantle and go out and find a fresh source of water. even though hundreds of boys have done this before and have not returned. So he goes to his Oba, which would be considered like their emperor, and he says, I'm gonna go and find fresh water. And she says, okay, I will give you a year, and in the meantime, I will take care of your mom. Here's a camel, here's some fresh water, go out and bring us water. And from there, he goes on an adventure and meets a few other people. And that's really all I can say because, again, I don't want to spoil this novella. It's very short. I did give it 3.5 stars. It wrapped up in a very satisfying way. In such a way, actually, that I don't know how the series is going to continue, which I will be pleasantly surprised once it does because I will be continuing on in this series. It was exactly what I needed when I picked it up. It was just full of adventure, but also didn't shy away from important topics. I have 3 more books to talk to you about. Can't really group them in any particular matter. So why don't we start off with my favorite book that I read in the month of April. That is Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. This was translated by Sophie Hughes, and it is a literary fiction horror book about a witch. And so at its surface, it is a murder mystery. There is this woman in a very small town in a city of Mexico. This town is located in a very isolated rural area of Mexico, and it's largely ignored by the government. There isn't any like big cities nearby. It's completely on its own. And so there is a lot of reliance on traditional ways of healing, a reliance on curanderas, and also there is a lot of gossip in the town and people making up stories and a lot of passing of information from word of mouth. And so right at the beginning of the novel, we find the town's witch has been murdered, and from there Fernanda Melchor divides the chapters based on people who either committed the crime or were close to the witch or were close to people who knew what happened. And we get to learn more about them, who they are as individuals, about their families, how they fit into the town's history. And through these chapters, she paints this vivid picture of this town while also addressing very important topics like this cycle of violence against women that is perpetuated in a patriarchal society, a government's willful neglect to investigate crimes against women. Now, I've had this book since it was originally published in English, which was back in maybe like 2019. I can't remember. I think it was 2019. And I was very hesitant to dive into because there are so many trigger warnings for this book. There is so much violence that is on page, and the author does not shy away from it. Some people were saying that it's very gratuitous. In my opinion, I didn't find it gratuitous, and I think that's where the horror elements come in, is that I actually read an interview that the author had, and she talks about how parts of the story were influenced by this news story she saw and how this woman was killed, and she went to this town to, figure out what happened. And I think she talks about some realities that some women and some people live. And some women in some places do live this reality. Some women live this reality within what we consider to be developed nations like the United States and the UK. We hear the stories about sexual abuse and domestic violence, and so she really captures this here and she really addresses it. She doesn't look away from it, and I find that there is some power in it, some power in voicing it and not shying away from it. So that's why I didn't think it was gratuitous. But again, your mileage may vary, so please look up trigger warnings if you do want to dive in. I was very pleasantly surprised and shocked, mostly surprised at how much I enjoyed it. I will be reading more books by her. I think she's had 2 more books out since she published this one. Her latest one might be a collection of short stories. Either way, I'm just really excited to continue to read from this author because I think she has a lot to offer and a lot of hard truths that she writes about, and I can get on board with that. The next book that I ended up reading is The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro. This was recently published on April 18th of 2023, and I gave it 3.5 stars. I actually received an ARC through NetGalley for this book, and this is a story about La Llorona, or a nod towards La Llorona. La Llorona is a folktale that a lot of Latin American people grew up with. The story goes, or at least how I heard it growing up, is that there's this woman dressed in white, who ended up drowning her kids before killing herself. I know that seems really, really dark. Growing up, I don't think anyone ever talked about why she drowned her kids. It was just a folktale that was sort of used to scare us without giving it any real context or history. And this is what The Haunting of Alejandra tries to do, giving her a story, talking about her as a person, but also as a haunting. And that is primarily what this story focuses on. We have our main character, Alejandra, and she moved away from Texas where her mom is, where her close friends are, where she has this sense of community for her husband. And I can't quite remember where they moved to, but they moved to this other state where, you know, there's not a lot of people that look like her, and she doesn't have a support system, and she's caring for her 3 kids while her husband constantly leaves. He's always traveling for business, and she feels disconnected from herself, disconnected from her culture, disconnected from her family, from her children. And on top of that, she has this weight of motherhood on her shoulders that she can't share with her husband because he's always gone. And then when he's there, he seems to make everything worse because he's very expectant of her. Like, you need to do the dishes, you need to cook, like, you don't have a job, what are you doing? These are your responsibilities. And so Alejandra starts to hear this voice inside of her head that almost seems to allude to her wanting to harm her children or harm herself. And so Alejandra asks for help because she thinks she's being haunted by the ghost of La Llorona. Now, that story on its own is already compelling, but then V. Castro adds that extra layer of addressing some issues that plague women in relationships that are not widely talked about and discussed. You know, like sharing responsibility with your husband and also needing support even though you're the primary person at home. Like, you still need that extra help from your husband, right? Or not wanting to take up space and making yourself small in a relationship so that it doesn't go sideways. And you know, some days just needing to be away from your kids. People also need that. And apart from that, V. Castro is a Latina woman, so she does, you know, address that part of our culture in the book, which I really appreciated. I think a lot of Mexican and Latino women can really see themselves in this book and feel represented. So I enjoyed it. It was my first book by V. Castro. I have one other one that I want to read. But yes, I give it 3.5 stars. Okay, so the last and final book that I ended up reading in the month of April is called Place of Cool Waters by Ndirangu, Githaiga, and this is a literary fiction book that was published back in August of 2022. So I did listen to this via audiobook and I gave it 2.5 stars. It was the one book that I didn't quite enjoy as much as the others. It was an interesting concept and I was really excited because parts of it are set in the Pacific Northwest, and so when like Powell's bookstore was mentioned or certain parts of Seattle were mentioned, I was like, ooh, you know, because I live in this area. So that was really exciting for me. And I also thought the premise of the story was really interesting because we are following these 2 very, very different characters. The first perspective we're following is that of Jude. He is a Black man living in the United States who was adopted by this white family, and he lived in a very small town right outside of Seattle for most of his life. And when he became an adult, he moved into Seattle, into this big city, and, you know, starts to have his first experiences dealing with microaggressions and racism in the workplace and in other parts of his life. The second perspective that we are following is that of Kadir, and he lives in Kenya. And while in Kenya, he is experiencing his own type of discrimination due to some political tensions there in the region. Now, without giving any spoilers, Jude decides that he wants to go to Kenya, and that is how these 2 characters interact and meet and their stories intersect. I think where the book failed for me is that the author tried to cover too many different things, like from racism to discrimination to family and grief, and all of these topics were covered in a very surface level way. I almost wished that the book was a little bit longer. That way he can really dig deep and talk about these topics. It sort of felt like he had this running list of like themes he wanted to include, and he would include it and then be like, check, next one. And personally, I am a thematic reader, so I do like it when themes are explored. And then the last thing that I quite didn't enjoy is the conversations. I feel like the dialogue is very, very, very clunky in this book. I feel like especially after reading through A Song of Ice and Fire, I realized how vital dialogue can be. Like George R.R. Martin does a great job with dialogue between characters. And while reading that series along with this book, it just made the dialogue feel even more clunky. The characters were just not vibing with each other. Sometimes it felt like they were following one thread and then all of a sudden one said something to make the plot go a different way. So it didn't feel organic or natural, but I am glad that I read it and that I was able to finish it. So those were all of the books that I read in the month of April. If you aren't already aware, there is a dystopian readathon that I am co-hosting with a couple of different booktubers here on YouTube and on Instagram. I will leave the announcement video down below. You can expect a couple of different videos from all of us, so make sure to check out all the channels. There will be a dystopian readathon TBR coming soon. Some people are including it with their May TBR, some people are not, and then you can also expect a couple of recommendation videos coming up. So stay tuned for those. Yeah, thank you for watching. If you made it this far, leave a, let's see, let's go with the classic. Leave a book emoji down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.